arrive at the idea of challenge sovereignty as a framework for understanding insecurity in the Caribbean?
Good question. Good place to begin, Chris. The genesis of the book goes back more than a decade. It started with the Eric Williams Memorial Lecture that I delivered at Florida International University, where I had been a dean and a professor for more than a decade. That lecture was delivered in 2011. Now, when I delivered that lecture, I focused on drugs and crime. And my intent was to publish something out of that lecture. But the manuscript for the lecture was too long to publish as an article. And so many people, particularly after the lecture was posted on the internet, FIU website, York College, where I was provost at the time, they posted it on their website. And lots of friends circulated it. They got so much wonderful commentary. I said, I'll make a book out of this. And so I approached University of Illinois Press, and they granted me a contract. I was supposed to have turned in the manuscript in 2013. But, as they say, life happened, and I moved around, never finished the book. As a matter of fact, I was worried at one point that I wouldn't complete the book, given the fact that I was taking so long and the manuscript was supposed to be submitted in 2013. But my editor said, not to worry, whenever you finish. Take your time. And that's the genesis of the book. It started as a focus on drugs and crime. But over time, as I reflected and wrote and did other things working in the region and around the world, I realized that a comprehensive portrait of the issues that impact sovereignty in the region required me to extend the conversation beyond drugs and crime to other clear and present dangers. And as I put in the package all the clear and present dangers, I saw the necessity to take a second look at the broader overarching issue of sovereignty. Because these issues, and I added to that box, terrorism and cybercrime, they were not only tangentially affecting the security of Caribbean countries, as had been affecting the security of other countries. They were going to the essence of sovereignty. But when I reflected on the traditional notion of sovereignty, and as you know, the traditional notion of sovereignty goes back to 1648, aftermath of the 30 Years' War that led to the Westphalia Conferences, out of which a treaty. When I reflected on what that traditional notion of sovereignty based on the Westphalia was all about, I saw that that traditional notion of sovereignty really didn't adequately express the reality of Caribbean and other small countries. And so I constructed this notion of what I call challenge sovereignty. And so you may be asking, what do I mean by challenge sovereignty? By challenge sovereignty, and I define that concept in the book. I define it as a condition where the state's vulnerability is exacerbated by the internal and external developments that compromise the ability of the supreme authority of the state to promulgate and execute a domestic and foreign policy in its own deliberate judgment and on its own terms. And so for me, a critical difference between the traditional notion of sovereignty and the construct I'm offering is that the Westphalian notion says sovereignty should be viewed in its international dimension. States in this global arena acting as international actors. But when you look at the impact of drugs and crime and cyber threats and terrorism, I find the necessity to look at both internal and external aspects of sovereignty. And so challenge sovereignty suggests let's have a two-dimensional approach to sovereignty, not just focus on the international. You've got to take a look at what's happening internally, what's happening domestically, where the state's abilities compromise because of that combination of internal and external realities.
Great. So let's look at some of those internal impacts that have led you to develop this thesis. Understanding criminal violence both as a citizen security and sovereignty threat, I'd like to just get your views on how this manifests throughout the region. After St. Kitts and Nevis, Jamaica has the highest homicide rate, not just in the Caribbean, but in the whole of the Americas, at least as of last year. And Jamaica features heavily in your book with the story of the violence surrounding the arrest and subsequent extradition of drug kingpin Christopher Dubas Koch. How has the security environment in Jamaica evolved since then? And do the same dynamics still explain the country's current security crisis?
Well, I think it's important, Chris, to take a step back to appreciate the Dudos affair and how it manifested then, and still in the aftermath of that affair, manifests a dramatic manifestation of challenge sovereignty. Because the Dudos affair clearly highlights the capability limitations internally, reflects the inability of the state to control the domestic landscape on a security and a political front. And even before I wrote this book, I wrote a book in 1997 called Drugs and Security in the Caribbean. And I had developed a notion called geonarcotic earlier, and I used that notion empirically in the Caribbean, looking at drugs and crime in the Caribbean, seeing how it's manifesting itself in geonarcotics terms. And when you look at the Jamaica case, you see the elements of geonarcotics going beyond security to sovereignty, in the sense that one would expect that the average Caribbean country is in Kitts Nevis or a Guyana or a Suriname. The state is in control of the domestic landscape writ large. Not so in Jamaica. And the Dudos affair highlighted capability, the structural capability limitations of the state. Dudos controlled and other dons controlled parts of Jamaica's territory that were outside of the purview, outside the control of the formal state. Police and the army could not go to some of those Tivoli gardens that Dudos controlled or other dons controlled. It couldn't go to those areas without the permission of Dudos. You would go to Jamaica, you would think that, let's say you go to Montego Bay. Police can go there, the army can go there. Not so Tivoli Gardens. Why? Because there was an understanding in Jamaica, more so then than now, that there was a kind of relationship between the bad guys, the dons, and the good guys, the state. The dons helped to provide the basis for political exercise of authority. The dons enable political parties to get votes so they can win power. Once they win power, the government gave contracts to the dons. The dons were able to maintain a legitimate business. Some of agriculture, some is contracting, fixing roads and businesses. But that legitimate business was only part of their operation. The real operation was in the drugs. And so you had the government being persona non grata in parts of Jamaica. Army, persona non grata in parts. The police, persona non grata. The state did not exercise control of the entire political and economic space. The dons did. And so you had a volcano erupting when that arrangement wanted to be interrupted by the government. When, as a result of the extradition treaty request, and I have a copy of that treaty as an appendix in the book, the government was unwillingly, reluctantly saying to the Jamaican people, we need to have this guy, Dudos, sent to the United States. People of Tivoli Gardens and other areas that were in support of Dudos were up in arms. I still remember some of those signs. After Jesus comes Dudos. And so what you had in the Dudos affair was a confluence of the political and the military and the law enforcement erupting, largely because the government had the nerve to want to rupture that arrangement that had been there for decades, where you guys do your own thing with your ganja and your criminality, but enable us to have the votes so we can get into power, and then we'll work out a deal where we give you contracts and you do your business. And the loss of life, the citizenry, from the police and the army, significant enough where even many people in the Caribbean, rest of the Caribbean, didn't understand what had been that simmering volcano in Jamaica for decades. Challenge sovereignty. So for me, the Dudos affair was one of the most dramatic manifestations, challenge sovereignty in the region. Now, thankfully, That whole episode necessitated the government taking a second look at the whole deal. You might recall that as a result of the episode and the significant damage, security and political, Prime Minister lost his job. New elections had to be called, a recalibration of political arrangements in Jamaica. And so the state is more sensitive to having these structured arrangements with the criminals that are part of the nation. The Dudas affair in Jamaica is one of the dramatic instances of challenged sovereignty in the entire Caribbean. Thankfully, there has been an attenuation in that arrangement, and the Dons do not exercise the kind of control over the physical space and over the political relations with the power brokers, the way it happened 2010, 2011, and the immediate aftermath.
Of course, another country where the state is not in control, in fact, where the state barely exists, is Haiti, which I think under your definition might be the archetypal case of a country where criminality has compromised sovereignty. And it has echoes of the earlier situation you described in Jamaica, being that the gangs control different territories and are aligned either with the government or with opposition forces. And to some extent, they also try to generate votes for their patrons. So Haiti seems to be the most archetypal case, as I mentioned a second ago, currently. But does it signal broader trends for the region, or is it just the most egregious form of challenged sovereignty?
I would say two quick things in response to that good question, Chris. One of the major differences between Jamaica and Haiti is the fact that Jamaica's Dudas affair had that volcanic eruption, and issues to address that eruption were brought to bear on Jamaica. Haiti has been simmering volcanoes, small volcanoes with periodic eruptions of significant magnitude over decades. Mm-hmm. And while that simmering volcanic eruptions over decades has been happening, the broader community within the Caribbean and beyond has been having, not Haiti again, kind of almost we're tired of these circumstances and not paying significant focused attention. But here's another significant difference between Jamaica. Jamaica represented, for the most part, the functioning of the state, except in those enclaves of violence. But in the case of Haiti, it's almost the entire physical landscape, the entire physical nation that has been under siege, not simply the enclaves, as if the entire Haitian physical space is one mass enclave. And so you had a rupturing and a destruction, an erosion of all the elements of the state. The legislature didn't work, the executive didn't work, all the branches of government were dysfunctional. Not so in Jamaica. You still had a functioning parliament, you still had a functioning executive branch, you still had a functioning judiciary to some extent. Dysfunctionalities in all of those. But in the case of Haiti, it was all the major branches of government were dysfunctional and dysfunctional simultaneously. And dysfunctional simultaneously to the extent where the rest of the region, the hemisphere, for a variety of reasons, didn't seem to be taking seriously enough at points in time. And complicating things in Jamaica, in Haiti, have been those environmental threats, the volcanoes, the earthquakes, the things that now complicate the ability of, even if the government was functioning, complicate the ability of the government to take care. I remember that, I think it was 2011, significant earthquake. How can you, with the circumstances of already ruptured governmental arrangement, take care of a society with that kind of physical, social, and economic damage? So Jamaica and Haiti stand out. But Haiti is in a class by itself. In the book, I describe it as the most extreme. I say on page 97, Haiti is undoubtedly the region's most dramatic case of challenged sovereignty because of the combined effects of political instability, economic destitution, out of control crime and violence, feuding gangs and kidnappings, most dramatic instance of challenged sovereignty.
Right. And we should recall that the earthquake produced something like 220,000 deaths. So for a state that didn't basically exist or was very weak at the time to respond to a catastrophe of that magnitude it was beyond its capabilities. I want to turn for a second to part of the power of the Dons or of the gangs, perhaps even more so in Haiti. Maybe not just part of the power, probably the most important instrument of their power are the fact that they are armed to the teeth. And in fact, their firearms, their weaponry in many cases is far superior to what police forces in Haiti and in other countries in the Caribbean possess. A month ago, at the end of July, Caribbean leaders met at the last CARICOM summit, and they issued a statement. And in part, they said, and I'm quoting here, "We're deeply concerned by the levels of crime and violence in the region, fueled in part by firearms and ammunition trafficking," unquote. And they listed a bunch of other causes as well. As I said a minute ago, in Haiti, we've seen the gangs possess greater firepower than the police. Is this the case in the other Caribbean states? And more importantly, perhaps, what can the U.S. do to reduce the flow of guns that are trafficked, often from Florida, into the Caribbean?
Thank you, Chris. Two parts to that question. I think what Haiti dramatically manifests itself in that nexus between guns and crime exists in varying degrees in other parts of the Caribbean, including the reality that in many societies in the region, the bad guys have more weapons than the good guys. But that disparity in firepower is only a partial reflection of the capability limitations writ large of Caribbean security forces. And the limitations extend not only insofar as firearms acquisition and use, it extends and includes the number of people who are arraigned as the forces in the police and the army. You know, one of the things I'd meant to do in this book, but I couldn't because the book was getting too big, is to look at the issue of private security in the region. In almost every Caribbean country, and Haiti is a more dramatic example of this, there are more people in the private security forces than in the public security forces. You go to Puerto Rico, you find that reality. If you go to Jamaica, you find that reality. You go almost every place. And those private security, they may not be deemed as gangs, but they operate with a certain amount of impunity as if they were gangs. Yes, there are a few countries, Jamaica being one of them, Trinidad and Tobago being one of them, where the government over time has tried to regulate by creating a regulatory authority. But the harsh reality is that those regulatory authorities have, for all practical purposes, become just revenue extraction mechanisms. Governments are concerned about how much they can get private security companies to pay for the license to maintain the business, and not very much regulation as to about training, about use of force, about weapons possession. And so what I'm suggesting, Chris, is that when you take the issue of the weapons capability disparity, you've got to take it in the context of a broader reality. And that is the larger outnumbering on the part of the private, whether it's the gang, vis-a-vis the public, army, or the police. It is quite true that most of the weapons going into the hands of both the private and the public forces come from the United States. That statement from which you quoted is not the first time the United Caribbean countries have raised anxiety about the arms element of the criminality experience in the region. April of last year, Trinidad, as you know, has the CARICOM responsibility for security. And Trinidad convened a symposium in Port of Spain looking at the business of drugs and crime and weapons and crime, but significantly saying we've got to look at the issue as a public health issue, not simply as a criminal justice issue. And they issued a large statement, communique as they call it, laying out a 15-point plan. I did a critique of that symposium, and I asked a question then, which is still a pertinent question. What has happened since that statement by way of implementation? And I would ask the same question with regard to the smaller part of that plan regarding the arms relationship. Again, partly because of the capability limitations of the various countries, there has to be a significant reliance on the United States and other sources for providing the assistance to enable something to be done about the arms trafficking and other elements of the weapons reality. Thankfully, the United States has been providing mechanisms, not only through the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative, but directly to help with tracing of weapons, to help control the flow of weapons. But as you know, the United States is caught between a rock and a hard place in some respects, because there is this thing called the Second Amendment where people take very seriously within the states their ability to purchase and sell arms. And so, although the government has the U.S. as a federal government has a good intention to manage the flow of weapons, it is coming up against the rights of individual states to do things that they see in their own state interests. And that's the reality of Florida. Not only proximate the Caribbean, but having some serious different views about the Second Amendment and the right to purchase and buy arms. You might recall where much of the arms for the coup attempt in Trinidad and Tobago came from Trinidad and Florida. And so United States has been at a federal level trying to ensure that there are measures that it has within its purview to enable all the tracing, the prevention of significant sale of weapons. But I'm among a set of people who've been advocating for Caribbean countries to take a leaf out of Mexico's book and begin to bring legal pressure against the manufacturers of the weapons. You know what the saga involving Mexico's legal efforts has been. And it was wonderful, in my view, to see that amicus curiae briefs were filed by Caribbean countries. I think the time is right for Caribbean countries to take the next step and go and file their own legal petitions. Because while the government's efforts are necessary, I'm talking about the U.S. government's efforts are not sufficient. The flow of arms will be there until there has to be manifest intent on the part of all actors. Manufacturers are significant actors to do something to curb the acquisition and sale of weapons in the Caribbean. I'm moderating a webinar next month, the Caribbean Policy Consortium, of which I'm a founding fellow. We have a partnership with the University of West Indies Institute of International Relations. And our fall 2024 webinar is going to be focused on this issue of arms trafficking, weapons relationships, and hopefully we'll have a sense there to have a more robust conversation about this critical issue, weapons acquisition, and what can be done by the relevant stakeholders. And I would repeat, the manufacturers are relevant stakeholders, and something has got to be done to sensitize them to have a different approach.
Physical violence and drug trafficking in the Caribbean is not a new challenge, as you've said. But regional dynamics are reshaping this threat in new and unexpected ways. One such emerging challenge you lay out in the book is the growth of cybercrime. What is the state of cybersecurity in the Caribbean, and how is this important for regional security?
The cybersecurity arena is one of the late-breaking Houston, we've got a problem areas. And it's Houston, we've got a problem area where perhaps most starkly you see the capability limitations. Because the capability limitations are not so much physical personnel as they are technological, as they are human training capability. And so it's a clear and present danger of a new kind. It's in the Caribbean. You see the challenge in the Caribbean as you see in other parts of the world, where what is reported is only the tip of the iceberg because there is a significant amount of reluctance on the part of the business community that are often targeted, reluctance to report. They fear exposing their vulnerabilities, whatever deals they may make privately with the hackers, the cyber criminals. They don't want those deals to be exposed to the point where there's a conversation within the CARICOM Impacts Implementation Chief of Security, which is based in Trinidad, beginning to recommend the governments of the region that it seems as though legislation is going to be necessary to mandate reporting. Because unless you understand the danger you're facing, you really can't treat with that danger. I was doing a briefing for the relatively new U.S. ambassador to the Caribbean based in Barbados, U.S. ambassador to Barbados in the Eastern Caribbean. And I shared with him media reports out of very Barbados, where the business community is so worried about the impact. And he asked me if it's just a Barbados problem. I said, no, ambassador, it's not just a Barbados problem. It's a problem that is growing, but what is reported is only the minuscule. Thankfully, CARICOM has some CARICOM Impacts as a dedicated, at least 2 officers, one of whom spoke at the launching of my Challenge Sovereignty book in Trinidad a couple of months ago, trying to wrap their arms around the cybersecurity issue. But it's one of those areas where the required assistance from the United States and other more expert capability areas is not only desired, is necessary, because this is a growing challenge that I know the Caribbean is not capable of handling by itself. And the reality is that even if there were capabilities within the region, the transnationality of cybercrime suggests that it's not simply amenable to one state or one region treating with it. I wrote a piece a couple of years ago. I was making the point that if there is one jurisdiction of the Caribbean that needs to put on its lookout for cybercrime hat, that jurisdiction is a place called Guyana, land of my birth. Because as we know, where flows oil, flows criminals. Where there flows oil, will flow crime and criminals. And I can anticipate not only increase, as you've begun to see in Guyana, trafficking humans and drugs. I can anticipate Guyana having to face a greater cybercrime challenge over the ensuing years.
The downside of a country that is growing and exponentially, it has something like a 64% increase in GDP year over year, given the incredible amounts of oil that have been discovered offshore. Ivolet, you also note that the threat of terrorism is not to be overlooked. We don't often equate in our minds terrorism in the Caribbean. Yet, as you point out, Trinidad and Tobago has had some of the highest rates of Islamic State recruitment in the Western Hemisphere. Why is that? And are there other areas in the region that are more at risk for terror recruitment or even terror attack?
In relation to your question, Chris, thankfully, no. As I said in the book, Trinidad has been a kind of anomaly. An anomaly, especially since it's not the only Anglophone or even Northern South American/Caribbean country that has a Muslim component. Guyana has it. Suriname has it. But you don't see any rush. You don't see the zealotry. Trinidad's role in this goes back to the 1990s. You remember 1990, while Saddam Hussein was doing his thing in the Middle East, there was a group called Jamaat al-Muslimin that tried to take power in Trinidad and Tobago. The Jamaat al-Muslimin has retained its strength, its zealotry over the decades. And although it is not a large physical number of people, there's an intensity to their zealotry that has meant they were willing to go beyond engaging in the domestic arena to see how they can follow the word of whatever their imams were saying, to go beyond Trinidad and Tobago. And so you found a trek for a number of years, a recruitment in many of the mosques, a trek to be part of the liberation of ISIS in a way in which you have not had that, the zealotry and the organization in other parts of the Caribbean. But I put that there because I think as we saw in the Caribbean in 1983, in the 1980s, things that you might think would be out of the bounds of possibility sometimes can become possible. Who would have thought you would have had a coup and overthrow the government in Grenada in the 1980s? Who would have thought we would have had a coup attempt by some Muslim radicals in Trinidad in the 1990s? So it's a reminder for Caribbean people and people who are interested in the Caribbean that there have been episodes of outside of the box, outside of the normal expectations of political conduct, military conduct in the region. And Trinidad has been a frequent reminder of those, no, it wouldn't happen here kind of sentiment. But thankfully, I don't find the landscape domestically or elsewhere in the region to be conducive to the same kind of thing. As a matter of fact, a lot of people who recruited and who went to Trinidad quickly realized that the picture that was painted of their opportunities were not there when they got there. And they've been returning. As a matter of fact, several families have sued the government to Trinidad because they feel the government is not acting fast enough to bring their people back home. They're the ones who left Trinidad. And when they got to the Middle East, they found that it's a different kind of heat. We want to go back home. And thankfully, I don't anticipate Trinidad to be a model that will be adopted by other countries in the region in that respect.
Well, that's certainly good news. Ivila, I want to kind of bring this conversation back to the beginning and maybe end where we started, where I mentioned that the Caribbean is often referred to as the third border of the United States. And ask you some questions or ask you a question about the U.S., which through mechanisms like the Caribbean Basin Security Initiative and entities like the Joint Interagency Task Force South has a long history of security cooperation with the Caribbean. How should U.S. security assistance in the region be rethought in light of the changing criminal landscape that you've described?
I had the pleasure, Chris, of testifying before Congress when President Obama sent to the Congress a CBSI proposal. And I'm delighted to see that even though in the last 8 years, there's been a fluctuation of funding. I think I have a table in the book that shows how the funding has been an up and down. I'm delighted in the last 3 years, it's been an effort to restore some of the cut funding. But the CBSI package has an interesting matrix for engagement. And there is one element of that package which I think I would really want to recommend more attention be given to. And that is a component of the CBSI funding package that has to do with youth. If you take a look at what's happening in the region, and I have some graphic evidence in the book, prisons overcrowding is a traumatic reality for most Caribbean countries. And if you ask yourself the question, who are the people in these prisons? It's mostly the people between 18 and 35, the young people. And I invoke Fyodor Dostoevsky, who said, if you really want to know what a civilization thinks of itself, take a look in its prisons. I worry about the long-term civilizational health of the Caribbean. If the nexus between criminality and imprisonment continues in the trajectory it has been on for a while, if that trajectory manifests itself in so many of the young who are in prison, especially in prisons where there is no rehabilitation. I chaired a conference 2 years ago in St. Kitts on penal reform. Chris, it was saddening to hear the reports from across the region. This is a conference that brought together prison chiefs, directors of public prosecutors, and other people in the criminal justice architecture of the Caribbean. And boy, I worry about what the region will become if the number of people in the prisons and overcrowding, and I tell some of the stories of the overcrowding. And so I'm really hoping that one of the things that CBSI, insofar as enabling the security assistance to be retained, is don't cut those components. Find a way to enhance the ability of the countries to deal with their prison overcrowding, to have some kind of rehabilitation, and to enable people to have a sense of hope. The recidivism is a significant challenge because there's no rehabilitation. They come out, all they know is the criminality, and so it's out of the prison, in the prison. So if there is one thing that I would love to see is an infusion of at least maintaining the funding and pay greater attention to the prison component, those youth that need skills training to make them productive, hopeful citizens in the region.
I think that's an issue that we could all get behind. Ivala, I want to thank you very much for joining us on 35 West today. We really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. And I wanted to congratulate you on your new book, Challenge Sovereignty, The Impact of Drugs, Crime, Terrorism, and Cyber Threats. Thanks again very much.
Thank you, man.